What's up, friends? It's Josh, and today I'm going to teach you how to fakie. Now, the fakie is a trick that I've seen a lot of riders a lot better than me struggle to be able to do. And when I say fakie, I don't just mean spin and pedal backwards. I mean the actual full trick, right? Go from going backwards to turning around and going forwards again. And there's really three main points that people get stuck on when they're trying to do fakies. The first is that change of direction phase when you're going from going forward to going backwards. The second is the rollback while you're kind of pedaling backwards and cruising backwards. And the third, probably the hardest part, is the actual revert, or when you go from going backwards to going forwards again. So today, I'm going to take the fakie, I'm going to break it down into those three parts, and I'm going to give you some tips of how you can improve whatever part you're stuck on along the way. So let's dive straight in at part number one, the change of direction. Now there's a lot of different ways you can go about changing your direction, going from going forward to backwards again. You can roll up a ramp like I did in the intro, you can do a 180, you can use your brakes, you can use a wall, but all of those things, with the exception of the 180, require you to come to a complete stop at some point. And in biking, when we come to a complete stop and balance there, we call that a track stand. And that's a skill that a lot of riders have trouble with. Basically, it looks like this. You have your bike and you balance on it. Now, track stands are a lot easier if you do them up against a wall. That looks like this. And to be honest, I could do this literally all day. It's really easy. And so for that reason, if you're struggling with part one of the fakie, the actual change of direction, and you're tipping over at that point, you're falling off, you can't keep your balance, I'm gonna recommend you go for the fakie off the wall strategy. Now, when you're just starting out with this technique, you can actually even skip pedaling or riding into it. You can just start right like this. What that's gonna do is it's gonna make that track stand part in the middle of going forwards and backwards a lot easier. Now, what do I mean when I say pull up off the wall? Well, when you're in here at your track stand, we're gonna start with your weight forward, you're gonna transfer that weight backwards. And it's important that you do that really evenly so that you roll back evenly like this. And you can just practice that over and over and over again. If for whatever reason this isn't working for you and you feel more comfortable doing it, say up a ramp and back down, or up a hill and back down, a technique I'd give for that, again, to help make that track stand part easier, is to actually do a little hop. If you've watched any trials mountain biking, or maybe you've seen some really skilled riders try to go up some technical single track, you might notice that they do some of this, just hopping around. For whatever reason, that makes it a lot easier to stay balanced in the track stand. So if you want to go and try doing the whole pedal up a hill and roll back down it, try doing a little hop or two in the middle, right at that change of direction, right at that track stand, and that'll make it a lot easier. Again, I don't really know the physics of it, but it helps. Now that we've got the actual change of direction figured out, let's talk about the rollback, or what a lot of people just call the fakie. That's the part where you're actually pedaling backwards and rolling backwards across the ground. And that kind of awkward motion of pedaling backwards, combined with the fact that now your steering is at the back of the bike instead of the front of the bike, and therefore it's a lot twitchier, makes this part of the trick pretty challenging. And so the biggest tip I have for this is to actually split those two things up, the pedaling backwards and the steering. First things first, let's work on just the steering. Let's isolate the steering and not worry about the pedaling. To do that, you can either take your chain off your bike if you're feeling exceptionally motivated, or you can just take your feet off the pedals, sit on your seat, and coast backwards. So to practice that, choose one of those different changes in direction, and then just take your feet off the pedals and practice coasting backwards and trying to keep yourself in a straight line, trying to avoid the swerving back and forth and be able to control your steering. Not only will that help you control your rollback, but actually being able to turn into that final part of the fakie, the revert that we'll talk about later on, that's gonna make it a lot easier. Once you've got the weird, awkward steering figured out, we can go on and talk about the weird, awkward pedaling. A couple mistakes I see quite a bit when people are in that rollback phase is they either try to pedal way too fast or way too slow. Let's say they're rolling back at 3 miles an hour. They'll just have their feet spinning like this, and that's not doing them any good. It's just gonna cause unnecessary motion that'll throw them off, and it's gonna make it more likely for them to derail their chain, especially if you're on a mountain bike. The other thing I see is people trying to fight that rollback motion, and that force, that resistance that's then gonna be going up your legs, is gonna cause you to tip and sway back and forth. Now, the only exception to that, the only time that you would want to try and resist that back wheel is if you were trying to slow your fakie down and you didn't have brakes. For most of us, I'm assuming most of you who are watching this channel, you're on a mountain bike, just use your brakes to slow yourself down. But if you're on a brakeless BMX bike or a brakeless dirt jumper, you can actually use your legs to resist that backwards motion of the wheel to slow down your fakie. All right, so a couple more tips. If you've ever done balance sports like gymnastics or slacklining, you know that they teach that you want to have your eyes fixed on a point in front of you to help you stay balanced. So for a lot of people, when they're faking, they want to pick a spot straight in front of them and basically just stare at it, again, to kind of help keep them lined up, keep them from swaying too much side to side or swerving back and forth. I'm a little weird. I do that technique sometimes, but honestly, usually what I do is I look down over my front tire. Some riders even like to look over their shoulder. So pick something like that and practice keeping your eyes locked onto something as you fakie. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to this second part, the rollback phase of the fakie, is bike setup. On mountain bikes, doing a fakie is a little bit more tricky because our drivetrain is kind of crazy. A couple tips I have for that. Number one, make sure that your drivetrain has been maintained well. Make sure your gears are indexed. Make sure you don't have a lot of excessive wear on your chain or your chain ring or your cassette. Make sure that your chain's lubed. Just kind of keeping up on all that will make this a lot easier. Number two is to shift in kind of a middle gear. You don't want to be too high up or too low in your cassette range. Otherwise, your chain line starts to get a little crooked, and that'll make it more likely to derail your chain as you're pedaling backwards. The third and final thing is that I highly recommend, if you don't already have a derailleur with a clutch as well as a chain guide on your bike, get both of those things. If you want to do fakie tricks, those are going to make it way less likely for your chain to derail. I would keep working on your rollbacks until you can pretty consistently get a 10 or so foot controlled rollback. Because even though sometimes you'll see people do a fakie and they'll just revert out really quick, being able to control your fakie for a little while almost acts as a little bit of insurance, just in case maybe you don't fully rotate your 180 or your rollback off of something at a little bit of an angle. So just practice that until you get that down. And once you have the rollback, you're ready to move on to part 3, the hardest part, which is the revert. All right, so if you're watching this right now, that means that you've probably got that change of direction dialed, you've got your rollback on lock, and you're ready to work on the hardest part of the fakie, which is the revert. In other words, changing directions back again from going backwards to going forwards. Now, there's a handful of techniques of how to do the revert. The one that I'm going to teach today is what I like the most and what I recommend you learn. I just call it the pedal pressure method, where you're using the energy input from your pedals to do the fakie. Some people do it by using their brakes. Some people do it by using a bunny hop. That's called a half cab, which is probably one of the most advanced and best looking ways to do a fakie. But today, we're just going to focus on the pedal pressure method. Regardless of which method you choose to revert, there's a couple things that are going to remain the same for everybody. The first thing that you should figure out is which direction you're going to do the revert, to the left or to the right. If you already have a direction that you prefer spinning on your bike, or for that matter, your snowboard or your skis or your skateboard or on a trampoline, then I would recommend doing it in that direction. So you kind of complete that full circle instead of spinning to the left and then going back out the other way to the right. It just looks weird, and depending on who you're with, they might kind of tease you for it. Now, if you don't already know which way you spin, a good rule of thumb is that most people spin towards their back foot. That's because when you're in your riding position, your hips are kind of already opened up to spin in that direction. It makes it a little bit easier. Some people though, like myself, are what they call goofy footed or dick footed, and we actually spin towards our front foot. I don't know why, that's just the way I learned how to do it when I was 8 years old, and so that's what comes most natural to me. So I ride left foot forward, spin to the left, and therefore, when I fakie, I do it to the left. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the actual technique that we're gonna use. I like to break a revert down into 2 parts. You have what you're doing with your upper body, and you have what you're doing with your lower body. We're gonna start with the upper body. I call that the turn, counter turn. So you've seen me do this a couple times in this video, but when I'm coming back from my fakie, I turn the bars, and then I do a real quick counter turn, like that. And that's why I told you it's important to work on step 2, making sure that you can control your steering as you're rolling backwards, because it plays a big effect into this last part, the revert. Now, there's a couple ways that you can make that turn, counter turn a little bit easier. One way is to carve into it a little bit more. So before you actually do the counter turn, you can get your bike almost all the way around and then just a little counter turn after it. Another thing that's really gonna help with this is using your eyes. Kind of like how we said when you're rolling backwards, we wanna have our eyes fixed on that point in front of us. With the fakie, we wanna lead with our eyes. So when we do the turn, on the counter turn, we wanna look where we wanna go. I made this mistake for a long time with my fakies, is I would do turn, counter turn, and I'd leave my head back here. And I was always surprised why I couldn't get all the way around with my fakie. It's because I wasn't leading with my head. So that's what we're gonna do with our upper part of our body. Now let's talk about the lower portion. Right in the middle of the turn, counter turn, right when you initiate that counter turn, we need to put in some kind of energy. We need to have an energy input, and that's what's gonna really kind of pop that bike around. And there's a few ways you can do that. As you might have guessed, since I call my method the pedal pressure method, I'm gonna use pressure on my cranks to do that. Some people do it with their brakes, some people do it with a bunny hop. All those methods work just fine, but I think the pedal pressure is the best one to learn as a beginner. So right when you're coming in, right when you get this turn and you're going to the counter turn, you're gonna stomp on your pedal. And that's gonna kick your bike up and it's gonna turn it around and get it in the right direction. Now, just like I talked about in the rollback section, bike setup is gonna have a little bit of an impact on your ability to do the pedal pressure rollout. And that's because at that moment, at that time where you put that hard pedal input, if your drivetrain isn't set up well, you can potentially derail or even break your chain. So make sure you go over those things that I talked about. If you're still having issues, if you're still slipping a chain or you're dealing with chains breaking, then you might need to try one of those other 2 methods. So I'm gonna touch on them just real quick. In terms of the brake method, which is probably the easiest out of all 3, all you really do is you just tap your brakes right at that moment of the turn, counter turn. So right as you're coming back, you do the turn, you tap your back brakes, and that causes you to pivot, and then you counter turn out. Like I said, the half cab's a lot trickier. Essentially what you're doing is like a half backwards bunny hop 180. So right as you get that turn right between the counter turn, you're actually gonna do a bunny hop and you're gonna come around the other way. Getting the timing down on this is gonna take some practice and some time. Like I said, the revert is the hardest part of the fakie, and you really just gotta drill it over and over again. But eventually, you'll be able to get the upper body portion and the lower body portion synced together, and you'll be able to get that revert every time. I hope you found that tutorial helpful. Go out there, practice those different things, get that change of direction dialed, practice your rollback, and then finally lock in that revert. Fakies are a really fun trick that you can kind of do anywhere. You can do it at a lunch break on a trail ride. You can do it in your driveway. You can do it at a skate park. And even though they don't have a ton of real practical application, say in a race or on a long trail ride with your friends, they teach a lot of good bike skills like balance and bike control. So I recommend you giving them a try. If you have any other suggestions for videos I should make or tutorials that you'd like to see, let me know in the comments. It helps out our channel if you give us a like and hit that subscribe button. And as always, we'll see you on the trail or maybe the skate park.